All right, this is lecture 2.3. It should be around page 7 if you have paper packets or in your digital packets. Just like before, you're taking notes in your packet, and then make sure you go back to Schoology and take care of the quiz as many times as you need until you get the score you want. All right, the last two classes have looked at the demographic transition as it has happened and is currently happening for countries, and then what that means for their politics, economy, and society. What this lecture focuses on where different countries, depending on their stage, what that means, what's next for them and for the world, okay? So we'll start off with stage 2 countries. So stage 2 countries, they are still, stage 2 and somewhat stage 3, they are still focusing in the future on dropping their CBR, their crude birth rate. Because remember, that is still quite high, and the death rate has already started to come down. So they're trying to lower population growth, okay? And they can do that the fastest way, or the one with like the fastest impact, is to improve access to reproductive health care and contraception. Sometimes that's subsidized, sometimes that's free, again, depending on the country. But the fastest way to have that is to improve access and acceptance of reproductive health care and contraception. Next, which takes a little longer to implement and to have kind of payoff for, is to improve access to and the quality of and kind of normalizing the quality of reproductive education. Okay, and then the third one that takes a lot longer is social norms, and that's less of a, it can still be policy, but it is also kind of a cultural trait, but is to start improving opportunities for women and women's pay and different leave policies, but it's to improve opportunities for women to work, and this then allows them to delay starting their families. So social norms, hardest one, longest one to change with the slowest payoff, fastest healthcare. All right. On the other side of the demographic transition, you have late stage 4 and stage 5 countries. Again, remember from earlier lectures, that's all those question marks. Remember, the U.S. we're in a late stage 4. We have a very slowly growing population because the birth rate and death rate are almost equal, meaning kind of neutral. A stage 5 country is all these question marks. So some countries have just entered into it, they're changing policies, and we don't quite know, question mark all over the place, of where that will go as more and more countries enter this stage. Stage 5, remember, is where the CBR, the birth rate, is below the CDR. This does not mean the CDR has skyrocketed. It just means that the birth rate is so low that it is less than the death rate. And at this point, the country's population begins to shrink because the NIR is negative. Okay? After that, again, the question mark of what policies to implement, and will they pay off as far as having either a replacement population or a growing population. Countries facing this right now are Japan, Russia, Bulgaria, Latvia. The Scandinavian countries are trying to get ahead of it, again, for all those social and economic reasons we talked about in the last unit. Okay? Those countries need a type of demographic policy. It's a pro-natalist policy. This means pro-birth, meaning encouraging birth. Most of the countries facing this, so like Japan, Eastern Europe, Scandinavia, the way that they encourage more births, because they know that having children is expensive, is hard, it takes up a lot of time, it can impact careers, is that they give out free childcare, sometimes all the way through like free preschool, etc. They have much more extensive parental leave policies compared to the United States, so sometimes 6 months to a year for both parents. They also have free or subsidized child care resources. So for example, every parent of every child in Finland gets a box of all the clothing and diapers and other things, bottles and all the stuff that you'll need for the first year of the life of their child. Again, to just reduce the cost and reduce the obstacles to having children. Okay? Other countries have had more draconian methods. These are not what you would answer on the AP test, but to be kind of aware of them. What the UN would pursue as encouraging policies for countries that have a shrinking population are the ones that I gave you. Draconian are ones that have been tried in the past in some countries, so criminalizing abortions or the use of contraception, most famously in Estonia. This happened a few decades ago. So you don't want to answer that. The way that the UN and other organizations encourage families to have more children is to, again, reduce the obstacles, not to criminalize any of those activities. Okay? Other countries with growing populations, so countries, stage 2, stage 3 countries, they need anti-natalist policies. This means against birth, so anti just literally means against birth. It means encouraging a decline in the birth rate. Okay? Examples of this would be the former one-child policy. India also had a two-child policy. Both of these led to the missing girls issue that we talked about in the last class, more severely so in some of the countries, smaller countries in the Middle East, where baby girls were being deliberately aborted in preference for baby boys, or infanticide, so shortly after birth, the baby girls being killed. So both of those countries no longer have those policies because their populations dropped, and now they have such a gender imbalance that it's creating other social issues. China has upped its birth acceptance. India, again, having gotten rid of its two-child policy. But both of those did have a population decline effect. Better anti-natalist policies that are, again, don't criminalize having children are all the programs we talked about where you lower CBR. But the downside to those is those can take a long time versus the one-child or two-child policies that did immediately start immediately dropping the population and the birth rate, but they had all kinds of kind of ancillary effects. All right, the next future question is the epidemiological transition. So remember, in stage 1, 2, it's massive infectious diseases, pandemics, epidemics, or receding pandemics and epidemics. Think smallpox, the plague, dysentery, cholera, all of that, the dominant cause of death. Once a country moves into stage 3 and 4, it becomes people are living long enough because medicine has gotten good enough where it becomes there are fewer infectious diseases, fewer epidemics, and it becomes the older age diseases, the lifestyle diseases, after years of bad diet and exercise, et cetera. So you have your heart disease, your diabetes, cancers, et cetera. The question is, just like with the population, is what will the future for stage, as more and more countries enter into stage 5, will it just continue to be degenerative diseases? Or with globalization and climate change, are we going to see the return of more and more infectious diseases? And this question was definitely the more and more of this question after the COVID pandemic, as we've seen more and more infectious diseases emerging, like Ebola, SARS, H1N1, and then obviously COVID. The question is, where will the epidemiological future be? So, and there's kind of 3 big reasons for the thought that infectious disease might return as kind of the dominant health problem. One is evolution. So the current diseases, there is a lot of fear for those thinking about going into public health or medicine about the evolution of antibiotic resistance bacterias, which will definitely be a growing concern in your lifetimes, or the built-up immunity of these things. And then obviously all of the evolutions of diseases as we put more and more strain on the environment. So the emergent diseases, zoonotic diseases, all the things that you're studying in your various science classes. A next big issue would be poverty. So again, that more and more of these infectious diseases will spread. So right now we kind of think of infectious disease being the dominant problem in stage 2, stage 3 countries, but with growing income gaps, with kind of the negative impacts of globalization, seeing more and more diseases spread because of this widening income gap. So with poverty and that income gap getting bigger, that there will be kind of more breeding ground for infectious disease that will then jump globally because of all our connections. Okay, an example of this is TB. So we don't deal with TB very much anymore, but a lot of the strains of TB or staph have become resistant to antibiotics, and right now they kind of are predominant in poor areas, but they are jumping and spreading because, again, all these global connections out of those poor areas and beyond. Okay, so that's the question: is will stagnant poverty and the evolution of diseases, those two things combined with our increasing connections, mean that we have more infectious diseases spreading again? So again, because of globalization, technology, and transportation, more diseases are spreading because of increased travel and trade. Easiest example is how quickly COVID took over the world. Okay, other ones thinking about like H1N1, SARS, several of these when you guys were more children. But again, all of these things could combine so that degenerative diseases, again, less of the dominant cause of death than infectious disease again. Okay, but again, we don't know. Many of you, if you go on to study public health, epidemiology, these will be the kinds of things that you're studying and trying to figure out where we're headed in the future. Okay, last is just global population in general. Where are we headed? This is not a new question. We're going to jump back in time to a name that maybe you've encountered in APES if you've taken that class, or perhaps Earth Science, but it is Thomas Malthus. He was an economist in the late 1700s, and he feared that there wouldn't be enough food for the new booming population. So England was the first country to start moving into one of the first countries to start moving into stage 2. So remember, that's where the death rate comes down, the birth rate stays high, and the population starts to really grow. Whereas before, because of the high death rate, most people were not living into their middle ages, and so the population was quite low. Once you enter stage 2, population starts to boom, and Malthus is like, oh my gosh, there's not going to be enough food. And again, the reason for this fear is because England had entered stage 2, and they were going through a surge. And he's like, farmers can't meet this new demands of this growing population. Okay, he was wrong at the time. He predicted all kinds of war and famine, and he was wrong because right at the same time that he was freaking out and England was growing, agricultural technology improved with the first industrial revolution. So before combustion engines and John Deere, there were machines. They were still human or horse-powered or oxen-powered machines, but they were more advanced technology than just like a shovel and a hoe. And so they expanded farm yields. They figured out natural fertilizers and crop rotation. So he was wrong. Farmers started to be able to grow more food, grow more effectively, and there was enough food for people at the time. Fast forward a couple hundred years to the 1960s, and this is when most of the developing world started leaving stage 1, entering into stage 2, and all over Asia and Africa and South America, those countries also began experiencing their big population booms as their birth rates stayed the same or grew, while their death rates were starting to decline, with healthcare and antibiotics and vaccines starting to spread to those countries. So they are called neo-Malthusians, same fears as the original Malthus, but they freaked out again as the developing world started entering stage 2. Just like Malthus's time, technology would save the day again in the 50s, 60s, 70s. So far, they've been wrong that we were going to not have enough food, again, for the growing population, and that's because right at the same time, there was the third agricultural revolution, or the Green Revolution, and this is where post-World War II, or right along with it, they started figuring out GMOs, or hybrid seeds. Coming off of all the ammunition of World War II, they figured out synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, and these vastly increased yields, so that, again, all the famine and starvation and wars that would go with it did not come to pass. In class, what you're going to debate is, so are we good? The population of the world will continue to grow. We'll talk about different predictions for where it might max out. And the question will be, Do we have anything to worry about with 10 billion, 12 billion people on the planet in the next 100 years in your lifetimes? Or are we going to be okay? Okay? But we'll leave it at that for class. Don't forget to go back to Schoology for the short quiz.